Approximately 9 hours ago, I reviewed a maritime traffic summary that did not look unusual at first glance. Vessel density in the Strait of Hormuz has always been high. Tankers queue, insurance premiums fluctuate, communications traffic ebbs and flows with routine congestion, but there was a deviation, subtle but measurable. Vessel speeds dropped below expected transit averages. Anchoring patterns increased outside standard holding areas, and more importantly, naval routing advisories began to shift from permissive to restrictive language. At that point, it suggested caution. Now, it confirms disruption. What we are observing in real time is the partial immobilization of a critical global choke point. More than 800 commercial vessels, tankers, container ships, bulk carriers are effectively trapped within or around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has initiated a naval escort mission to guide select vessels through the passage. Tehran, in response, has issued explicit warnings against foreign military interference. This is no longer a maritime traffic issue. This is a controlled confrontation in one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on the planet. I spent over 3 decades inside military and intelligence environments where maritime choke points were not theoretical constructs. They were operational vulnerabilities. We modeled them. We wargamed them. We tracked them continuously because when they are stressed, the consequences move far beyond the region in which they exist. And this, what is unfolding now, is not just an operation. It is a structural shift. Let me reconstruct the situation as it likely developed. Initial indicators began within hours of escalating regional tensions tied to recent military activity. Maritime traffic control systems started registering irregular course adjustments. Ships that would normally transit the strait within 6 to 8 hours extended their timelines. Some halted entirely. Communications from shipping companies shifted tone from routine scheduling to risk assessment. Within the next operational window, approximately 3 to 5 hours later, naval reconnaissance assets, both regional and external, began increasing surveillance coverage. That is a standard response. What changed was the posture. Monitoring became positioning. By the 6th hour, multiple naval advisories had been issued, warning commercial operators of elevated risk conditions. At this stage, the situation had moved from observation to management. Now, roughly 800 or more vessels are either stationary, slow-moving, or awaiting escort clearance. The number itself matters, but not for the reason most assume. It is not the congestion. It is the concentration. A concentration of that scale creates vulnerability, and vulnerability in a contested environment becomes leverage. Let me explain how the escort mission fits into this. The United States naval escort operation is not simply about guiding ships. It is about controlling movement under contested conditions. Escort groups typically consist of surface combatants, destroyers or cruisers, equipped with layered defense systems, radar coverage, and communication links capable of coordinating both air and sea responses. On paper, such an escort should provide deterrence. A visible military presence signals that interference will be met with force. In reality, deterrence in a narrow waterway is constrained by geometry. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest navigable point, is approximately 21 nautical miles wide. Shipping lanes are even tighter, effectively 2 channels each about 2 miles across, separated by a buffer zone. That means every vessel, military or civilian, is operating within predictable corridors. Predictability matters. It means any actor seeking to disrupt movement does not need to control the entire strait. It needs only to threaten specific segments of those corridors. This brings us to the system failure component, not in the sense of malfunction, but in the sense of doctrinal limitation. Modern naval doctrine assumes layered defense, early detection, threat classification, interception, response. But these systems are optimized for discrete threats, missiles, drones, fast attack craft. They are not optimized for sustained pressure across multiple domains simultaneously. If you introduce overlapping threats, mines in one sector, drone surveillance in another, missile positioning on shore, the defensive system is forced into prioritization. Algorithms begin to decide which threat matters most, and that is where vulnerability emerges. This was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of doctrine. Doctrine assumed that presence equals control. In reality, presence under constrained geography creates exposure. Let me bring this down to practical terms. A naval escort can protect a limited number of vessels at a time. It cannot escort 800 simultaneously. That means sequencing. Groups are formed, routes are cleared, timing windows are established. Each of those steps introduces delay. Each delay compounds congestion, and congestion increases risk density. Now consider the threat environment in simplified but precise terms. The primary risks in the Strait of Hormuz are not hypothetical. They are known and documented. Anti-ship missiles positioned along the coastline can cover the entire transit corridor. These systems operate through radar guidance, infrared tracking, or a combination of both. Once launched, they travel at high subsonic or supersonic speeds, depending on the platform, and are designed to strike vessels at or near the waterline. Naval mines present a different challenge. They are passive until triggered. They do not require continuous guidance. Once deployed, they create persistent denial zones that are difficult to clear quickly. Unmanned aerial systems, drones, add a surveillance and strike layer. They can track movement, relay targeting data, or conduct direct attacks. Here's what that means in practical terms. An escort group must defend against threats it can see, threats it can detect, and threats it cannot immediately locate. That difference matters. Now we arrive at the question that defines the current moment. Why has there not been a direct confrontation? Why the warnings but not the strikes? I have seen this pattern before. The silence is the signal. Tehran's posture indicates readiness without execution. That is deliberate. Immediate disruption would escalate the situation beyond control. Controlled pressure, however, maintains leverage. There are 3 questions being evaluated right now. First, how much disruption is required to achieve strategic signaling without triggering full-scale conflict? Second, how far can foreign naval forces operate before the risk threshold becomes unacceptable? Third, what level of global economic pressure will force external actors into negotiation? These are operational calculations. From the perspective of the United States, the escort mission also operates under constraints. Military assets must maintain defensive readiness. Rules of engagement must remain tightly controlled. Any escalation, intentional or accidental, could trigger a broader conflict. And that is where strategic hesitation becomes visible. Major powers are watching, closely, but they are not acting decisively. Why? Because every available option carries cost. Escalation risks are immediate. A direct naval confrontation in the Strait would not remain localized. It would extend into airspace, into regional bases, and potentially into global energy markets. Political hesitation is not indecision. It is a calculation. The silence you are observing is not absence. It is a constraint. The silence is the signal. Now we shift from the immediate to the structural. This outcome was not sudden. It was built over decades. For years, strategic assessments identified the Strait of Hormuz as a critical vulnerability. Approximately 20% of global oil supply transits through this narrow passage. That number has been cited repeatedly in policy documents, military briefings, and economic forecasts. This was known. This was documented. And yet, mitigation strategies remain limited. Why? Because alternatives, pipeline routes, diversified supply chains, regional stabilization, require long-term investment and political alignment. Those conditions were not sustained. Instead, reliance on the status quo persisted. The assumption was that deterrence would hold. On paper, that assumption was valid. In reality, deterrence depends on perception, and perception shifts when capability and intent align under pressure. I will be candid. There were discussions, years ago, about scenarios where maritime chokepoints would be contested without direct closure. Partial disruption, controlled congestion, strategic ambiguity. At the time, those scenarios were treated as edge cases. Looking at the current situation, they appear less theoretical. That is not a comfortable realization. But it is an accurate one. Now consider the global consequences. Energy markets respond not only to actual disruption, but to perceived risk. Insurance premiums for shipping through the strait have already increased. Delays in transit affect supply chains beyond energy. Manufacturing, food distribution, industrial materials. This is not a regional issue. It is a global pressure point. We are operating in a multipolar environment. That means multiple centers of power, each interpreting the situation through its own strategic lens. Some will see opportunities, others will see risk. All will adjust. This matters. Because behavior in one region informs decisions in another. Now, step back further. At its core, this situation reflects a fundamental principle. Control is not defined by presence alone. It is defined by the ability to sustain movement under pressure. Capability and will. Capability determines what can be done. Will determines what is chosen. The United States has the capability to project naval power into the strait. That is evident. The question is how that capability will be applied under constraint. Tehran has the capability to disrupt without fully closing the strait. That is also evident. The question is how far that disruption will be taken. This is where uncertainty resides, not in what is possible, but in what will be decided. So I will leave you with this. We are not simply observing a maritime disruption. We are observing a controlled test of global systems, military, economic, and political. If those systems hold, the strait remains open under tension. If they fail, the consequences extend far beyond shipping lanes. The question is not what happens next. The question is why a system so critical to global stability is now being tested under conditions that were anticipated, documented, and yet not fully mitigated. If this analysis adds clarity, share it with others who are trying to understand the structure behind the headlines. And if you disagree with this assessment, I want to hear that as well. Because in situations like this, understanding is not built through agreement. It is built through disciplined examination of what we are actually seeing.